effect.
(1970), and a new decade started confidently with a world exhibition at Osaka. But Japan was about to be hit by a series of shocks that would test everything she'd achieved since the war.
明けて3月15日、いよいよ一般公開です。330万平方メートルの会場を目指しまして、まさに民族の大移動が始まりました。
Osaka was the first World's Fair to be held in Asia.
日本人らしく、よそ国の他国の模範になるような行動をこれからやっていただきとうございます。
For millions of Japanese visitors, it was a time for national pride. 77 countries put their achievements on show. But no nation had as much to boast about as Japan itself. They were more prosperous than ever before. They'd grown faster than any other country. But 1970 was also a time to take stock. Industry had had first priority through the years of rapid growth. Now the costs of that growth were being recognized. Pollution was a political issue. All the profits of the new Japan had been plowed back into industry, not spent to improve living conditions. In the sprawling cities, there were new offices and factories with little planning or open space. The Japanese commuted to work from cramped housing. There'd been too little government spending on public services. Drainage was primitive. Open sewers still ran behind high-rise buildings. Japan's leaders had put business first, but one politician sensed it was time to change the priorities.
朝から晩までビルの中にだけ、街箱の中にだけは住めないんです。そうすれば周りに少しは緑のあるところを考えればどうするんですか。そこで日本列島改造というのが出てくるんですよ。皆さん、東京や大阪や名古屋は確かに非常に混乱をしておりますが、まだまだ日本にはたくさん土地がありますよ。
This was a new political appeal. Putting the quality of life first would require a vast public spending program. Its author, Kakue Tanaka, was a new sort of prime minister. His secretary was Shigezo Hayasaka.
I was the person who dreamed up the name, The Rebuilding of the Japanese Archipelago. Tanaka came up with quite a boring title, My Highway Policy. But I said, no, boss, that's no good. Let's call it The Rebuilding of the Japanese Archipelago. The plan was to extend the high-speed train, the Shinkansen, from north to south, from Sapporo to Kagoshima. This would be a backbone. Then to bore tunnels through Japan's central mountain range, so Shinkansen lines could be built to run from one side to the other, like a set of ribs, reaching the northeast, the north, and almost on most other areas. Then he wanted the expressways to spread across the country like a network of blood vessels. In this way, we could reduce travel time and distances at a single stroke. Movement of people, money, and goods would become freer. That was the big point.
Tanaka's plans could be afforded only if Japan's export-led growth, up to 10% a year, continued at the same pace. And that assumption and all the optimism of Expo were about to be shaken by two devastating blows. Most of Japan's exports went to America.
Because of the progress we have made...
In 1971, President Nixon, facing an economic crisis, suddenly devalued the dollar and put a surcharge on all imports.
As a result of these actions, the product of American labor will be more competitive, and the unfair edge that some of our foreign competition has will be removed.
The Japanese called it the Nixon shock. There was a stock market slump. With the change in exchange rate and the surcharge on imports, the price of Japanese goods in America rose by up to 20%. Export orders were cancelled. The good time seemed to be over, but a worse shock was yet to come. The other assumption behind Japan's success was cheap oil. Oil from the Middle East had fueled the economic miracle. In 1973, another Arab-Israeli war broke out. It lasted only a few weeks, but the effect on the world economy went on for years. The Arabs raised their oil prices and cut back supplies to countries who'd supported Israel, and they threatened to cut off all their supplies next. Japan was hit the worst of all the industrialized nations. 85% of its oil was shipped from the Arab countries. With no supplies of its own, Japan's post-war miracle was about to come off the rails.
Until now, we'd enjoyed very low-cost energy from the Arabs, so we used cheap oil both as a fuel and as raw material. The price was so low that economic growth was greater than we'd ever hoped. But now the supply was suddenly cut off. This came as a great shock. What could we do?
Because this was the first time that the Japanese government had ever experienced anything like this, they were not very well prepared to deal with the crisis. So, in a word, there was panic. That was what it was like.
The full horror of Japan's situation emerged as the government tried to find out how much oil they had in reserve and how long the country could keep going if the Arabs turned off the taps completely. Prime Minister Tanaka took charge. The head of the newly formed Energy Resources Agency was called in.
Normally, we officials aren't invited to cabinet meetings, but because it was such a crisis, joint sessions were held continually involving the cabinet, leaders of the LDP, that's the governing party, and us lot. And it was at one of those joint meetings that I had to announce that Japan had only 4 days' stock of oil left. If you left out what was already in the supply line, the running stock, there was only 4 days' worth of reserves.
When he was told there were only 4 days' reserves left, Tanaka banged the table with his fist and shouted, "This is idiotic."
Tanaka spoke to the Diet, appealing for calm. For a time, Japan came near to a national nervous breakdown. The pressure on politicians and civil servants was intense. The officials worked day and night.
2 officials got into a really terrible state. They'd become mentally deranged. I think they went mad. Anyway, because of lack of sleep, they started behaving strangely, and they were taken off to hospital and given morphine injections to stop their brain cells from dying. You never knew who would be the next to collapse.
As the exhausted bureaucrats searched for new sources of supply and put controls on the use of energy, there was a shortage of the paraffin which most Japanese still used for heating and cooking. Petrol was just as scarce. Fuel prices rose, and garages closed down one day a week.
現実にタンクが私どもの地下タンクが空っぽ
When our underground petrol storage tanks were empty and we couldn't supply anybody, people would accuse us of lying or hiding it from them. Fill it up, they'd shout. That was how people reacted at the time.
お叱りを受けたということが随分ありましたね。そんな反応だったと思います。
ここはね、東京の銀座と言いまして、
This is the Ginza in Tokyo. It's a very famous part of Tokyo. And when people come from the country, it's one of the places they want to see.
東京見物の中の一つに入ってる有名なとこなんですけどもね。で、そのオイルショックの時には、今このようにネオンが明るくしておりますけども、
Now it's brightly lit with neon lights. But at the time of the oil shock, the lights were all turned off early as an economy measure to save electricity.
早い時間にね、その節減されていってしまったという情景。
In the offices, on government instructions, there was a new gloom. Heating was turned down. Every other lift was switched off to save power.
秋になって突如トイレットペーパーが店先から消えた。
Housewives, starting to panic, bought up everyday necessities.
買おうと思っても物がない。毎日使う品だけに不安が主婦たちを駆り立てる。関西に始まった行列が今瞬くうちに全国へ広がった。当然のように値段は上がり、春先には110円程度であった品が一時は380円になった。
It seemed things would get worse as long as the Arabs classed Japan as an unfriendly nation.
毎月 5% ずつ削減されていくとすると、
If the oil supply was cut by 5% a month, as the Arabs were planning to do, then Japan was going to run completely out of oil by the following March.
そうなるとパニックが起きて暴動が起こると、そういう心配を非常にしましたね。
We were desperately worried that if this happened, people would panic and start rioting. So we felt it was vital to restore friendly nation status with the Arabs by December at the latest and normalize our oil supply. We felt we had to do our best to achieve that.
So the Japanese sent envoys to swear undying friendship with the Arabs. In a turnaround that was as fast as it was unprincipled, foreign policy altered. The Japanese detached themselves from the Israeli cause and the American position. Their flexibility paid off. With King Faisal of Saudi Arabia's help, Japan was restored to the list of friendly countries. The supply of oil was secured, but now it cost 4 times as much as before. There would be a huge rise in Japan's import bill. Japan was headed for a deficit. Tanaka, the great advocate of more public spending, had to abandon his reforms. He asked Mr. Fukuda, an old financial hand, for help.
He said to me, the Japanese economy is in a terrible mess. I want you to take over as finance minister. I said, I would only accept on one condition. I said, I want you to abandon your plan to rebuild the archipelago, which you've been advocating for so long. I said, unless this was done, the measures to counter the crisis would not work.
While Fukuda cut spending and raised interest rates, the economy slumped into recession. The old, high-energy-using industries, like chemicals, were hit worst.
In effect, all Japanese energy depended on oil, including electricity, because oil was used to generate electricity. The economy depended almost completely on oil. Our company was typical. We'd been through a period when growth had just gone on and on, and then suddenly, crash. We ran into the oil shock, and it really was a terrible blow.
The steel industry had been one of the stars of the 1950s and 60s, building vast new works, but their production costs now went haywire.
It's an industry which uses energy in vast quantities. In fact, the steel industry used 18% of Japan's total energy consumption, and a fifth of that 18% was oil. So the sudden steep rises in the price of oil had a very big impact on the steel industry. Worse still, when the economy went into decline, we then suffered a drop in demand for steel as well. It's like being hit twice, a left and then a right.
It wasn't just big firms that were affected by the shocks. In the back streets, hundreds of thousands of small family-run concerns worked as subcontractors. The Okada Banking Company made metal parts for big electrical firms. They faced their most difficult months.
We had a meeting every morning. I was the sales manager, and because there was no work, I would be told to go out and find some. As I drove off in my car, I'd feel the anxieties and worries of all the employees on my shoulders. Anyway, off I would go. I would see one customer, then two, then three, and the answer was always the same. Go away, we haven't got any work for you. I did this every day, day after day, until there was nowhere left to go. I remember one day vividly. I looked at my watch. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a day in April, the time when the cherry blossom flowers for a few days and soon falls. Everyone in Japan has their memories of cherry blossom time. I remember I stopped the car at a spot where the cherry blossoms were falling and being blown away by the wind and thinking, I just can't go back. I had nothing to show. I'd done the rounds, but I had not taken a single order. And I knew they were all back at the works waiting for me. Eventually, I had to go back. I remember it all too well.
The sense of urgency during the energy crisis was that Japan, without resources, unless we do something fundamentally different from the past, we will die. And that sense of urgency forced everyone to do all kinds of belt tightening. And as a result, as viewed from outside, Japan as a country was doing something extraordinary. It was actually individual companies' efforts.
We received over 3,000 suggestions from our workers. We sifted through them and selected what we could use. We managed to reduce our electrical consumption by 44% over a 10-month period.
44% 削減され、目標としてですね、エネルギーを従来の2分の1にする。
Our target was to cut energy consumption by half, cut man-hours by another half, and cut the amount of raw materials we used by 2/3. These were the measures we took.
こういう運動です。
Turning off lights was the first thing we did. But we're in the business of making things. So we looked hard for economies within the actual production process itself. We put a lot of effort into seeing whether a woman could do things, or can that job be handled by a machine, or would it be faster doing it this way, and so on.
As managers tried to cut costs and raise efficiency, there was a new pressure from the workers. They demanded higher wages to meet the higher prices in the shops. Inflation was soaring in Japan, as it was everywhere. In 1974, it hit 32%.
The biggest, most urgent problem to be tackled was inflation. I spoke to the Japanese people and summed up this inflation in a single phrase. I explained, what we faced was no ordinary inflation, but mad inflation. This caught on and became quite a catchphrase at the time.
At first, the unions demanded pay rises in step with inflation, as they did in Europe and America. What was different was that in Japan, with a real sense of crisis, government appeals for moderation worked. In 1974, Mr. Miyata of the Steelworkers Union gave the lead.
I wasn't selling out to the government at all. The reason was that I knew inflation was no friend of the working man. Without fail, it's the workers who suffer most from inflation. I said that if we restrained ourselves now, then things would get better later and the good life would be around the corner. So let's aim for that. Because of my plea, the situation didn't get out of hand.
It was a turning point. After the steelworkers, other unions followed. They were persuaded that big pay rises now would be bad for their own pockets in the long term.
率的に言えば 10% から 15% の間、我々としては具体的に言えばですね、要は世間相場といいますか、それだけはやはり確保したい。我々日本の国というのはこれまで非常に急速に発展してきた。そういう中で我々の賃金も当然上昇し。
The oil shock was a catalyst for change. The old industries like textiles, which had given Japan its first export successes, were cut down. Changes which could have taken decades were compressed into a few years. Old plant was scrapped and spare capacity was closed. With heavy government involvement and industry-wide cooperation, companies were persuaded to merge and diversify. As in other countries, restructuring had a human cost with painful closures. Where possible, large Japanese firms moved their workers.
その中の人間の何分の1しか雇用できないわけで、大部分の人は、
We couldn't keep everyone on.
幸い東海岸の方にいろんな工場を持ってます。
Fortunately, we had our other factories on the East Coast. So we asked people either to transfer to permanent jobs there, and if they couldn't move house, then to accept long-term postings for periods of 3 years or so. This is what we asked them to do, and many did. But we had a lot of people who came from farming backgrounds, and amongst them were some who just couldn't leave their homes. So several dozen of them had to leave the company altogether. I still remember to this day that as the people went out of the factory gates, they faced their old workplace, bowed deeply, and then turned and left. It still upsets me to remember, but it is a precious memory.
The best years were now over for Japan's shipbuilders. After the war, they'd overtaken the rest of the world, but now yards were closing.
やはり何回やってもですね、浸水はジーンとくるもんですけど、今回は本当に最後の最後ということで、胸が一瞬詰まったなんですけど、
175隻目の浸水を終えたわけですけどね、ボールを入れるところから最初から磨いて、そういったことからやってきたんですけどね、非常にこの仙台の表に立ってもう浸水がなくなるということは非常に寂しい気持ちです。
With the world recession, fewer ships were needed, and the Koreans, with lower wages, could build them more cheaply. So yards that had made 500,000-ton tankers had to make do with repair work.
Before the oil shock, shipbuilding was a glamorous industry. If you worked in the yards, you had good wages and no problems finding a wife. Lots of people wanted to be taken on.
But after
the oil shock, the newspapers and television went on about shipbuilding being in recession. So young men thought that if they worked in a shipyard, girls wouldn't want to marry them. And school teachers started to say things like, if you don't study harder, you'll wind up in the shipyards.
In Britain, the closure of a shipyard meant mass unemployment, but in Japan, the big companies felt responsible for their workers.
The problem was what to do with the workers. In Japan, the government allows companies to dismiss or lay off workers in exceptional circumstances, but Japanese management has a culture, a sense of moral responsibility that we should keep people employed at all costs. And we feel this sense of responsibility quite strongly.
Shipbuilding companies diversified into plant engineering and steel fabrication. The skills used in shipbuilding weren't wasted, they were transferred. Other workers were uprooted and sent further away. It was possible for Mitsubishi shipbuilders to retrain as Mitsubishi car workers, or find work in even newer, high-tech areas.
I had lots of new things to learn, such as the right way to use cutting machines or about new materials. I found it really hard going at first. The measurements were also completely different. Whereas before I'd been working to tolerances of around 10 millimeters, now I was working to around 1/100th of a millimeter. I mean, right down to the level of microns. I found changes of this sort really hard.
Companies couldn't take the easy course and lay off workers, so they had to bring down costs in other ways. Increasing productivity per worker is the only way to survive.
The Japanese, you have to be married to the workforce. So you don't worry about the workforce, that's a given. In order to increase competitiveness, you have to give them wage increase every year, and therefore this means you have to reduce hours worked in order to assemble a TV. If it takes 120 minutes, now it's 20 minutes. You can absorb 6 times wage increase and cost would be still the same. Therefore, driving the hours and man hours down was the major way. This meant automation.
New machine tools were the most common route to automation. Computer-controlled machines could be programmed to do the same work over and over again with total accuracy. They were introduced more rapidly than in any other country. Even the smallest Japanese firms bought them in the 1970s.
These are metal plates used for control boxes. Before the oil shock, we used this hydraulic bending machine to make them. In order to overcome the oil shock, we bought this bending machine fitted with CNC, computer numerical control. As a result, we managed to cut the time to 1/5 of what it had previously taken, and the quality and accuracy were unbelievably better.
But the automation that really excited the Japanese was the robot. Like much of Japan's technology, robots were initially developed in the United States, but the Japanese were the first to make real commercial use of them in a story that had a familiar pattern to it. In 1967, an American engineer, Joe Engelberger, went to Tokyo to lecture on the pioneering work he was doing.
Here in the United States, I was able to get maybe 8 or 10 people to listen. And they brought something like 600 engineers and scientists and executives to hear my lecture. And being as polite as the Japanese always are, they said, we better make out some little slips of questions in case nobody asks a question. So we had these little slips ready. I got on the dais at 1:30 and they dragged me off at 6:30. And the people were that enthusiastic about this technology, which was a revelation compared to the way it had been in the United States.
Engelberger was developing a computer-assisted industrial robot which could weld or assemble with new precision, called the Unimate. There was nothing like it in Japan. Mr. Okada from the Kawasaki company heard about it and flew to see the inventor.
When I eventually met Mr. Engelberger for the first time, he showed me his robots, and I listened to his explanation. He told me, this is a great machine, it can do anything. I've done all I can to promote it in America, but nobody's interested. I replied that if it were put on the market in Japan, it would do extremely well.
Mr. Okada was, I guess, a very simpatico kind of an individual, and he pleaded the case that Kawasaki really wanted to move into this field, and he was quite aggressive about it.
Mr. Engelberger said to me, how come when I've been trying so hard to sell it in America and getting nowhere, you come along and say you can sell it in Japan? I replied that in Japan, unlike in America, we had no cheap labor to do the dirty work. America still had plenty of slaves. So if you leave it up to us, we'll show you we're right. We'll sell lots of them. Mr. Engelberger said, all right, and accepted my proposal.
Mr. Okada's company bought the license to build the first industrial robot in Japan to the American design. They improved it, made it more reliable, and started to sell it to Japanese companies.
We have, not only in robotics, but in a lot of areas, come up with the initial idea, the original concept, and we've been extremely slow at exploiting it. The thing that I give most credit to the Japanese for is their ability to implement, and implementation was the thing, and move with dispatch. Another thing that I've noticed is that they may have controversy at the outset, but they don't proceed until they have consensus. And there isn't anybody knocking the effort down once it's been decided to go. That's bad, you lose face, it's very bad to do that. It may take a while, but boy, when they get going, it's all together now, and we're going to succeed.
The new machines were welcomed on the factory floor. The humans carried on alongside, relieved of the dirtier and more physically demanding jobs. The car industry placed the largest orders in the mid-1970s as they tried to make small cars even more cheaply after the oil shock. Unlike other countries where insecurity was greater, the unions didn't see the robots as a threat.
Each robot was given a name. When we installed about 20 of them in a big car factory in the Tokyo area, the workers named each of them after a female pop singer. For example, Momue Yamaguchi, who was a big star at that time. Then they'd write the name out and stick it on the side of the robot. Then, if one of the robots broke down, as they occasionally did, they'd call out, "Momue, Momue." That's how the maintenance engineer would know where to go, and he'd come running to fix it. So, even though robots were just machines, because they gave names to them, I think they felt an affection for them.
Building robots was a fast-growing new industry in itself. Fanuc became Japan's most profitable company, using robots to build more robots. By 1980, over 14,000 robots had been installed in Japanese factories, but there were only 4,000 in the United States and a few hundred in Britain. Even the smallest workshops were introduced to them. There was special help from the government. Small employers like Mr. Tanaka were given cheap loans to buy their first robot.
This is a metal fitting to go on the side of a telegraph pole. We make about 300,000 of them a year. In the old days, when we used skilled labour, we only made between 350 and 400 a day. With robots, that doubled. Now we turn out 700 every day without any mistake. When we introduced robots, they did the work with complete reliability. With humans, you always had to consider how they felt. Sometimes they'd have a good day, sometimes a bad day, and their output would fluctuate up and down. But the good thing about a robot is that it will always produce the same number every day without fail.
So, through energy saving and restructuring and automation, Japan overcame the blows of the early 1970s. Output rose 4 times over, but they were using less oil than they had done in 1973. In 1979, the world was hit again. Once more, oil prices more than doubled following the Iranian Revolution. And once again, there was a government-led drive to save energy.
Most garages now close on Sundays, part of the Japanese government's vigorous campaign to cut energy consumption by at least 5%. A notice explains the reasons for Sunday closing and makes a mild joke at the expense of the oil-producing countries. Television ads urge housewives to do their part. In the words of the advertising jingle, switch it off, switch it off. Even the Prime Minister's got into the act. Somewhat self-consciously, he models a new lightweight creation costing a mere £70. Public servants and politicians have been told to wear open-neck shirts so the air conditioning can be turned down.
Since the first oil shock, just one country had restored itself to health: Japan. For other countries in the world, including America and Europe, the second oil shock was like a double punch. Because Japan's economy had recovered and was doing so well, the effects of the second oil shock went virtually unnoticed.
Japan's bureaucrats helped the country to shift industrial direction deliberately. It was a new chapter in the Japanese government's industrial policy. The Ministry of Trade and Industry had been looking well ahead even before the first oil shock. They published a vision for the Japanese economy in the 1970s. Written by Mr. Ameya, it was prophetic.
We have to change our industrial structure to those industries which consume less energy and also consumes resources which are abundant in Japan. We thought that the most abundant resources in Japan is our human brains. So we have to develop our resources in this small box instead of the resources underground.
The new industry that Miti promoted hardest was electronics. The Japanese had gone into the mass production of radios and televisions, but the Americans were still way ahead in advanced technology because of their defense and space work. Catching up became a national target, shared by the electronic firms and the government. Developing Japanese computers had top priority. Computers were the ideal new industry, with their very high value and low raw material costs. What mattered was the research and brainpower that went into them. The United States, led by IBM, dominated the world. Japanese managers visited American factories.
What struck me most in America was the size of the electronics factories. They were gigantic. Some of them were very highly automated, and I had the impression that in most respects they were very advanced indeed. I saw how they were pumping vast sums of money into research and development. I thought they are so far ahead, there really is a huge gap between them and us. All the time I felt it was like Gulliver and the Little People. But even so, I didn't find that the gap was so great that we wouldn't be able to catch up.
Japanese firms could make the cheap transistors and integrated circuits for radios and televisions, but for their computers they still needed to import from America the more advanced devices which crammed thousands of transistors onto one tiny piece of silicon.
Semiconductor chips were the keystone of the communications and computer industry, as well as the mass-produced consumer electrical goods industry. So it was very important for Japan to produce her own semiconductor chips. Otherwise, it was clear there was no way she would gain a competitive edge in the final finished product.
The major Japanese firms poured millions into chip design in the early 1970s, packing more and more onto what was called the Large-Scale Integrated Circuit, or LSI. Their production methods and reliability were getting better all the time. They concentrated on memory chips. Each new generation became a commercial race as capacity rose from 4K up to 16K, then 64K. It was a national race as well. The Japanese had their sights on America's Silicon Valley. When they heard the Americans were about to leapfrog and develop a super chip thousands of times more powerful than anything before, the government was alarmed. The whole country's future competitiveness seemed to be at stake. So the Ministry of Trade and Industry launched a crash program to beat the Americans and develop Japan's own superchip, or very large-scale integrated circuit, first.
Our big technological challenge at that time was the development of the VLSI. So the Ministry of Trade and Industry gathered top scientists from all over the private sector into a research association. So we were able to assist in the creation of a scheme in which Japan's great brains could put their genius to good use in a cooperative research project.
Engineers from the big companies, normally the fiercest of rivals, came together to do the basic research for the next generation of electronics. The cooperation was unprecedented.
I was head of this joint research center. And the first thing I did was to ensure that the companies sent only good people. In any kind of organization, the most important ingredient is the staff. So I made a very careful selection of who was to come and join me. I put a lot of effort into discussions with the companies. I got each of the companies to provide one laboratory chief, and they brought their own top-class people with them. That was how I ensured that I got together an outstanding team.
While the VLSI laboratory was starting on basic research for the superchip, the electronic companies made huge investments in new factories. They increased their market share. As they reached each new level, imported American chips were no longer purchased.
Quite frankly, it is the presumption of many strategists in the United States, I think in Europe, that in critical markets, if the Japanese can drive competitors out by whatever tactic necessary, then that leaves a very gigantic market share remainder for them in the future. So the Japanese moved with immense aggressiveness in this area. And it was a pivotal area because it is pivotal to the development and the practice of technology. And if they could control the pivotal point, they could also therefore have an influence on the other aspects of the industry.
そして今 エンジニアたちはもっと集積度の高い高性能 LSI、いわゆる超 LSI の開発を目指しています。それはもう例えて言えば光学顕微鏡から電子顕微鏡の世界への移行を意味しています。
Within a few years, they took the technological lead with memory chips. The first superchip wasn't American, it was Japanese.
こんな小さい、これが超 LSI ですけれども。
This is it. This is a VLSI chip. The equivalent of 1 million transistors are packed into this tiny thing. And thanks to its creation, we can now make computers which are the size of a book. And the production of robots has become very easy.
非常に容易にできるようになった。IC その発展 LSI 超 LSI この全部
When one looks at the overall development of integrated circuits, LSI chips and VLSI chips, and compares it to the invention of printing, printing made possible the reproduction of written matter, but chips made all kinds of electronic goods cheap and easy to use. I think it may have had a greater impact than the invention of printing.
効果を持ってんじゃないかという気がします。
The microchip was the new rice of industry. It allowed a constant flow of new consumer products and went into new production methods and robots. The video recorder was typical. In the mid-1970s, the huge Matsushita company poured millions into developing the VHS system. Mr. Tani, seen with the founder of the company, was in charge of production.
アメリカでもある時期は、ヨーロッパでもある時期は、やはりこういった
At one stage, both America and Europe too put a lot of effort into the research and development of these video cassette recorders. However, they gave up halfway through and stopped doing it.
我々はいくら何回か失敗をしましたけれども、やり続けてきたというのは
We met with failure after failure. But there's one simple reason why we carried on. The Japanese have always liked a good challenge.
The successful manufacture of the video recorder simply wouldn't have been possible without the new microchips.
The more parts you have, the more of a drawback it is from the point of view of mass production. So somehow you must try to reduce the number of parts you use. This means using chips as much as possible. We made every effort to incorporate as many chips as possible into the design, and so reduce the number of other electrical components. More important, by using chips or semiconductors, you can improve quality compared with the older designs. Product quality is now much better and measurable. The cost comes down. So, chips play a vital role, as you can see.
The Japanese put chips into everything. They were used to update old models with new features, and they allowed entirely new products onto the market. They went into calculators, cameras, cookers, ovens, and even sewing machines.
家庭用電子ミシンの組み立て。ブラザーが誇るミシンの機械技術に最新鋭のエレクトロニクス技術をドッキングさせ、製品の電子化を積極的に行っています。
This is a rice cooker from the early 70s. All it can do is boil rice, and it can only boil Japanese rice. However, this is an 80s model, made after the development of semiconductors. And one of the big advantages is that you can boil a variety of different sorts of rice. The machine automatically calculates the amount of time it takes to cook. Things of this kind are made possible by semiconductors.
This is the first high-speed digital fax machine in the world, which we at RICO brought out in 1975. With this, you could send a fax in as little as a minute, compared with the 6 minutes it took until then. But as you can see, it's still very large. 15 years later, we reduced it to this size. But it's not just smaller. It performs 5 times as fast as the other machine. This will send the same messages in about 12 seconds. This shows how far we came with the advances in semiconductor and other technology.
Japanese companies increased their spending on research and development steadily. The turnaround time for new products and new models, which were first sold on the huge home market, got shorter all the time.
Competition was cutthroat because our customers' demands were changing all the time. Society was changing. Customers were no longer satisfied with products from the year before last, or even last year. When we thought we'd produce something new, that we'd come up with the right thing for next year, they'd already be asking us for something better. The competition in Japan was such that if you didn't keep up, or in fact if you couldn't keep one step ahead of it, then you didn't survive.
The Japanese industries that have made it overseas are characterized by severe domestic competition. We have more than 20 camera companies. You have to survive. We used to have 120 motorbike companies. You have to survive. Only 4 survived in Japan. And by the way, the other 4 survived in the world. So you have to survive in the domestic marketplace. In this kind of efforts, cutthroat competition, was the reason for strengthening and streamlining their management. When they went abroad in the late 70s, it turned out with all these efforts of value engineering and cost reduction, with this experience of surviving through cutthroat competition domestically, overseas competition was a piece of cake.
The most successful Japanese products offered something new as well as quality and price. After hi-fi and video came CD players and communications equipment. Only 10 years after the oil crisis, the Japanese had overcome it. Their goods were everywhere. They cut a swathe through world markets. The United States felt the onslaught most of all. As consumers, Americans bought most Japanese goods. As workers, it was their jobs that were affected.
If you think of the American effort, the Apollo project to go to the moon, the Japanese were able to create the same kind of broad-based consensus and cooperation in their efforts to achieve leadership in those particular industries that the U.S. was able to achieve in trying to go to the moon. And so you can't say it was just industry targeting. That was a part of it. You can't say that it was just low-cost capital. That was a part of it. All of those things were put together in a single overarching strategy.
But the strategy of concentrating on industrial leadership above all else still carried a cost and had side effects at home and abroad. Exports had been more important than ever after the oil shock. Japan had needed to export more to pay for her oil and had overachieved. Her trading success brought continuing friction with her closest ally.
When we were exporting transistor radios to the United States, it was not really a threat to the American electronic industry, but when we started to sell television sets, this was their bread and butter. And that's when they started to feel the Japanese invasion, so to speak. And therefore they moved to institute a protectionism measures such as involuntary or voluntary quota system. And that's the beginning of the American electronic industry's resistance to Japan. And subsequently, of course, when we started to make semiconductors cheaper than in the United States, so-called microchips, then the resistance became greater.
Japanese made excellent technical strides in the late 70s and the early 80s in that regard, and they are due considerable credit in that regard. But simultaneously, when they marketed these products, they marketed them at predatory prices, prices that very often were under their costs and lower than what they were allowing for their sales prices in their home market, dumping, in other words.
Despite all the export successes, back on the home front, the ordinary Japanese still work longer hours than Europeans or Americans, up to 10 hours more a week. They took shorter holidays, and the wages they earned bought fewer goods.
If we look at the quality of life around us, whether it be the problems of roads or of land prices or other forms of amenity, it's very noticeable that Japan has given too much priority to the interests of corporations all along. The gap caused by putting the standard of living in only second or third place continues to widen. So land prices and housing have become a social and political challenge we have to meet.
Wealth has been fairly equally distributed. Incomes have gone up substantially. Everybody can buy a car. Everybody goes out to eat. Bonuses have shot up. In ways like this, wealth has been recycled, returned to the people, and they've increased their savings. Because companies grew larger and richer, the problem of investment was solved. As companies became big and powerful, their workers benefited at the same time. So it would be a lie to say that business prospered while people didn't.
The effects of the oil shock had reached into every level of Japanese industry, honing the efficiency of big firms and small. There was no let-up.
We're still working hard even now, and the oil shock was, what, 15, 20 years ago now? The fact that it was so long ago, and we're still hard at it, shows the legacy it left. Despite the strength of the large companies and Japan's economic successes, you can't ignore the fact that we're still working extremely hard.
For nearly 40 years, Japan had been run by a political party which put industry first. Its businessmen called the shots. Economically and industrially, the recovery from the shocks was a brilliant success. Japanese companies were now world leaders. Public sector spending had been held back for a further period so that all the capital possible could go into new factories and offices. But 10 years after the oil shock, many of the same questions were being asked about priorities as they were in 1970. The Japanese people still lived in small, crowded houses. Land prices had put home ownership out of the reach of millions. Japan was stronger than ever, but its people did not feel richer.